you so much, Julia, and welcome everyone. Thank you for joining us. My name is Pirronne Yousefzadeh. My pronouns are she, her. I'm the Associate Artistic Director at Playwrights Center. And I want to welcome you to our Artists in Conversation featuring these three extraordinary playwrights on my screen who are all part of our PlayLabs Festival. But before we dive in, I just want to start by acknowledging that Playwrights Center sits on the land of the Dakota people and Anishinaabe Ojibwe people. We want to offer our gratitude to this land for the privilege of gathering and sharing stories and being in conversation like the one we'll have tonight, and for the work of Native and Indigenous activists, past, present, and future, who challenge us to be stewards rather than owners and have stewarded this land for generations. If you're interested in learning more about all of the incredible work of Native and Indigenous organizations in the Twin Cities, I encourage you to visit the land acknowledgement page on our website. And if you want to also learn about the land on which you reside, I'm going to put a little resource here in the chat, and you can use that in your own time whenever you like. And so now to take us into the conversation, I'm going to have some questions for our lovely panel. And then as Julia mentioned, we will have time for questions from our wonderful audience here. And I encourage you to use that Q&A function. We'll have about 15 minutes at the end of the hour for those questions. But before we jump in, I'd love to ask all of the writers to introduce themselves with your names, your pronouns, if you'd like to share them, and anything you want to share about yourself as an artist. And I'm going to start with you, Benjamin Benne. Hello.
Hello. Good to see all your faces. And thanks to all of you tuning in. I'm Benjamin Benne. I go by Ben. My pronouns are he, him, his. I'm a current core writer at the Playwrights Center and the writer of Phantasma.
Great. Let's pass it over to Mathilde.
Hi, everybody. I'm Mathilde, which is like Matilda, but you have to stop before you get to the end. Mathilde Dratwa. I use she, her pronouns. I'm also a core writer at the Playwrights Center. And I wrote the play Esther Perel, We're in My Life.
And last but not least, Peter. Oh, you're muted, my friend. It happens.
I do it every time. Every time. 5 years on, I still do it. My name is Gil-Sheridan. You say the whole thing all the way through. Don't stop at any point, the whole name. And my pronouns are he, him, his. And I wrote what was called Pirate Steel is now called Maybe When You're Older. And I'm still not 100% sure that that's the title, but we'll see. We'll see. We'll see what happens week to week.
New plays, baby. Great. Excellent. Well, I just have to say once again, it's so great to see you all again. And we really miss you at the center after just such an invigorating and such an inspiring couple weeks watching you all work on your plays and how they evolved over the course of that time and all of the ways that you took that learning and discovering forward. So folks who are joining us either saw the reading in person or had the opportunity to stream the play last week. So spoilers are welcome at this point. And I would love to hear y'all talk a little bit about how you think about the relationship between the story you're telling in each of your three plays and any sort of sense of experimentation with form or exploration of structure. And Peter, I'd love to start with you.
Sure. So what's interesting for me about this play is that I started writing it at a silent retreat that I was on called Still Write with Eric N. And the idea is that you show up to this retreat with Eric, who's kind of a much more experimental playwright than I am. You show up with no play and you write a play as you write a play as he gives you various exercises. And this is, the idea is to sort of break you of your kind of habits as a writer and kind of approach your work in a new way. And so I took this on, and if you know me, you know that I'm not like necessarily a silence expert or a silence professional. So it was like pretty intimidating. And but I felt like I needed a little shakeup in my process. So I had a couple goals in sitting down to write it, which one was to write a play that wasn't about me for a change, because so much of my work is about me directly, like with no real, mask on it. And so I started writing based on what he was asking us to do in our exercises. And I had these pirates turn up, and I had two pair of mother and daughters turn up. And I didn't know why or how these plots connected. And it actually was in the writing of the play that I began to understand how they connected. I kind of was inventing it as I went, as opposed to kind of knowing what it was right at the beginning. And as a result, I ended up writing a play that I think is very different from me, a play that is not what I normally do. In the end, I still think it's about me. In a funny way, I think all of our plays are probably about us. And in the rewriting of it, I think I brought it more and more to me. In fact, I watch it and I'm like, actually, this play is more quintessentially me than any other play I've ever written. But it started from this other place. So the form to me feels really different. I'm really trying to kind of purposefully confuse you, but like hopefully in a good way, not in a bad way. That was my goal, that you would be delightfully sort of perplexed at why these stories were being thrown together, and that as the play went, you would begin to understand more and more why you were watching these disparate worlds come into play. Does that answer the question, Pirronne?
That 100% answers the question. Thanks, Peter. Mathilde or Ben, would you like to share a little bit of your perspective?
Ben, you go first.
Me first. Okay. I mean, I guess I'll start by saying that I tend to be like a content first, and sort of story and form kind of come later in the process for me. So for Fantasma, I've known for a long time that I wanted to write a play about my mother and her side of the family, who were immigrants from Guatemala, and their journey to the United States and sort of the assimilation process they underwent here. So I think the story started to come into focus finally when I was back home for the first time after many years during holidays, and I asked my grandmother to help me do a recipe for chuchitos. So that was very much pulled from life, and that friction around like wanting to assign metrics to something that is known mostly through the body and through the senses was something that was a true encounter. And I was like, once I had that experience, I was like, I feel like that's the story. I think it's about this family doing this recipe. And at the time I was in a class, a dramaturgy class, where we were talking about the difference between archival memory and embodied memory. And something about that was speaking to me in terms of this question of assimilation, and like, how do we preserve culture through documentation, but how so much of culture lives in the body and just through people's senses and memories. And what is gained and lost through those two methods of memory transference. And so I knew that was the story that I was telling. And it wasn't until I finally decided to look at The Long Christmas Dinner, which was recommended to me by one of my teachers, Sarah Rule, that I was like, oh, I think this play is doing something that I'm really excited about and feel like might be in conversation with how I want to organize this content. So yeah, so that's how I went from like the content to like some form of story to like eventually finding the form for the play.
Great, thank you, Ben. How about you, Mathilde?
I was like, Ben, you go first, because I need more time to gather my thoughts. And then I was so fascinated by what Ben was saying that I didn't do that at all. I think for me, form and content find each other as I write. I know in other plays I've written, I've sort of thought that I was writing a two-hander and then ended up with 6 characters, or I've realized as I was writing about my dad in another play that my relationship with my dad is all about the things we don't say. So then a chorus appeared to sort of say all the subtext that we're not able to say to each other. And with this play, I knew I wanted to write about sex in a way that I haven't seen written about before. And I sort of had this idea that I would write a play about a woman who the very first scene fakes an orgasm, that sort of lights up. She fakes an orgasm, and then her journey towards not actually towards having an orgasm, but having an experience where she doesn't feel the need to say what she's experiencing and communicate it. And then that felt very specific and didn't end up working. But as I was writing, I think I landed on something that felt right for the story. Something I've learned about my writing that is consistent throughout all plays is that my transitions are very abrupt, and that scenes like to sort of butt up against each other. And often one scene sort of ends with a question or with a problem or with a challenge, and then the next scene is informed by it or is flipped by it or something like that. And then it happens again and happens again. What I found doing the 2-week workshop at the Playwrights Center that was really fun was that the script as I had it when I walked in didn't do this, but by the end of the 2 weeks, the scenes start with like a pretty complete scene between two characters, and then another pretty complete scene between two different characters. And then they start getting shorter and shorter and butting up against each other more. And they start sort of almost interrupting each other until there's a big conflict. And during the conflict, it's literally the character who's in all the scenes and the two other characters or she's in 2 scenes at once. That felt really right. And that's something that I learned in process, is that I wanted the two characters to start to inform each other a little bit more, and the character in the middle to sort of get a little more frazzled by the speed of the transitions.
That's great. Thank you. So, it was interesting thinking about all 3 of your plays, which are so vastly different from each other. And also, I did have some parallels in the sense that there is a way in which you so smartly dole out like information to us, revelations of character, revelations of history, the like familial history, the true story of the family. And I'm just wondering about if you can talk a little bit about, and I know this is a huge question that could probably itself take an hour to talk through, how you manage the sort of the calibration of how that information is revealed, and the balance of like the sort of surprise and inevitability that I think we can feel as an audience to varying degrees as these things happen in plays. And I know obviously this conversation for you, Peter, very intimately, having worked with you on your play during PlayLabs. So I'm wondering if you can share a little bit about sort of how you've been thinking about that in maybe when you're older. And by the way, my cat is riveted by everything y'all are saying. She's learning a lot that she's going to apply to her next one cat show. Peter, take it away.
It's so funny because I teach at a college, and I talk to my undergraduate playwright students about this kind of stuff all the time. And one of the things that I find again and again when a student comes in with a new play or part of a play is that they tend to write the last scene of the play first, and they give away everything right away, and then they don't know where to go. And I'm always having to tell them to like go backward and like go back to the part where they weren't able to articulate this thing. And so the play, as it goes, becomes this journey toward articulation for the characters and for the playwright and for the audience, I think. So so for me, that was, and my teacher was Sherry Kramer in grad school, who I think is like the world's best playwriting teacher. And because obviously, I mean, look what she's made, but like but one of the things she says that's so amazing is that, when we come to the end of a play, all of it in retrospect should be inevitable. So that there's this idea that like, just like Dorothy Gale in The Wizard of Oz, you've been wearing the ruby red slippers the whole time. You just didn't know that they were as magical as they are. And in the same way, when you're watching a play, you don't really know how to watch what you're watching, but by the end you have the tools to actually understand what it is that you've just seen. So not to get too much into like teachery playwriting mode, but specifically in terms of how it relates to my play, is I was really interested in this notion of withholding and sort of letting the characters just kind of live in a world where they weren't necessarily always talking about like the point, right? They were sort of talking about everything but the point, and that in the process of avoiding talking about the things that they need to talk about, those mothers and daughters, they were doing incredible damage to one another. And yet that withholding is necessary, because how do you talk to an 8-year-old about sexual assault, or a 10-year-old or a 12-year-old, right? So there's this trap that the mothers in my play are in, where they can't actually, yeah, I sympathize with them. I have such compassion with them for not being able to actually speak directly and freely about what it is that they're struggling with. And so in the first, one of the things I love that the Playwrights Center does is that there's these 2 readings, and you have one midway, and then you have one a week later. It was so useful. I keep saying it was like the best part of the whole thing was to be able to have a test run in the middle of the thing. Because so often you get to the end of one of these workshops and you're released back into the world without any support, and you need to be able to kind of process what just happened. And so I think what I found, one of the actors from Ben's play said to me in the lobby, I felt really satisfied by your ending, but I was so angry at you throughout the play. And I was like, oh no, like I think I maybe withheld a little too much, so the process for me at the Playwrights Center, especially in week 2, was figuring out like what crumbs can I drop without feeling like I was making the play like overtly obvious, or losing the sort of essential mystery of the piece.
Yeah, absolutely. I'm wondering, Ben, if you can talk a little bit about this, because I think that like in a related way, there is a lot of sort of family history that is uncovered in the course of Phantasma.
Yeah, totally. I mean, I definitely think about a play as like a puzzle, and something that I've realized about my process is I tend to know how the play starts, but I don't really know what the ending is when I begin. And so I really am usually just writing in a way that surprises me halfway through the play until that moment of like, oh, now I see the ending. And I think that inevitability piece comes into play for me. So in some way, I think I'm just doing this really intuitively. And there were certainly like events that I knew were going to be part of the storytelling for Phantasma before I began writing, but I didn't necessarily know how they were going to unfold. So I hope that in the same way I was surprised as I was writing it and certain things just started happening in a certain order. The hope is that that same sort of journey of discovery is true for the audience until there's maybe a moment where you can see where it's going, where, suddenly it's like, oh, at some point, enough of these family members are going to be gone and we're going to be left with someone. And what is that going to look like? So that was fun. So once I realized that, like, yes, all the family members were going to disappear up until the final generation, then it was just a matter of figuring out what order. And the rewriting process, I think, for me was really where I started to tinker with that and see what happens if one person disappeared before another. Something that Jackie Sibley's jury imparted to me as a teacher was from Gertrude Stein about how the audience is always ahead or behind the story in some way. And so it's our job as the writer to kind of calibrate as much as possible where we think the audience is and subvert expectations based on whether we think they're ahead or behind, which I think is something, Mathilde, you do beautifully with the structure you described earlier in terms of like ending with a question and then having like suddenly some sort of answer or flip to the question happen in the very next scene.
Thank you. I think for me, it's interesting hearing you both speak because I didn't go to grad school for playwriting, so I can't be like, well, my teacher says, because I didn't have that experience. But I do think that it's something that I love about my job as a writer is thinking about how we're imparting information. And I don't think I think about it sort of from a rational, logical lens. Like I don't plot it out, but I do think there is something that I'm fascinated by in theater when the emotional logic is really satisfying. And so for this play, I think back to sort of when there's been a journey in my life of any sort over several months or maybe even years. And I tell the stories, I try to tell it chronologically, and then I sort of falter. And I'm like, it's like when you start with a new therapist and you're trying to catch them up to everything. Or like a couples therapist, and they're like, okay, so what brings you here? And you're like, okay, so 5 years ago, but then yesterday, but also like 3 years ago, this happened. And that was crazy because actually now I'm here, but I started there. And I think that there's something really satisfying when plays take you through that journey. So whether or not it's chronologically linear, there is a satisfying journey. And what we're seeing are sort of the touch points. So we're not seeing every single thing that happened along a journey, but we're seeing where it's like, you're going across the country and you like see the Grand Canyon, and then it's like, what are the big moments to stop and see? And then the next time we see it, they're in a different place, and then a different place. And what does that look like?
Yeah, I think like just to say like, I mean, we've talked about this, but I think that there is just such a brilliant subversion in Esther Perel Ruined My Life, in the sense that like right out of the gate, I expect Aaron to have a certain experience in the open relationship that he does not have. And that it is actually like this sort of blossoming time of self-actualization for Andrea, where we originally, I think, are set up to think she's not going to be into it, or she's not even really going to engage with it all that much, and it's really going to be more for him and sort of get her off the hook from feeling like she has to be sexual when she doesn't feel like it. And so I'm just wondering if you can just like probe that specifically. Was that something that sort of appeared for you instantaneously in the writing of the play, in terms of that sort of original subversion of expectation, that sort of big surprise from, I think it's like your second to your third scene, that we're like, oh, wait, something shifted?
Yeah, it's interesting because in this play, I think the jump between scene 1 and 2 and the jump between scene 2 and 3 are sort of the biggest jumps, I think, in terms of all the things that happen in between that we don't know, and we have to be like, oh. And some of it's trial and error. I know that this workshop at the Playwrights Center taught me that the way I'd originally written the transition between scenes 1 and scene 2, there was just a little bit missing, because if someone didn't know who Esther Perel was, it used to just end with Aaron saying, have you heard of Esther Perel? And then we cut to scene 2 and they've opened up their relationship and all these things, and people were just like, whoa. And so I learned that we just needed a little bit more information. And so that kind of tweaking, I think, comes from trial and error. I think in terms of their journeys, I knew that I knew what I didn't want. I didn't want to judge anybody in the play, and I didn't want to have anything be too neat or tidy or make a didactic point about what I think about open relationships or anything like that. I just wanted to show people sort of being surprised, trying things and being surprised. And that doesn't mean necessarily they have to fully change their mind about anything, but I just wanted them to go like, oh, this is a totally unintended. And I thought it would be cool if the completely unintended consequence of all of this is that Aaron actually learns more about his wife. Like if rather than it being about what happens to him, it's like, oh, it's not even necessarily something she wanted to start off with. She's interested, she finds out all kinds of things, and Aaron gets to learn about her in a way that is sort of beautiful, I think. So that's the kind of story I wanted to tell, and I knew that, but I didn't know each of the steps yet.
Yeah, it's so interesting to hear that, just in terms of like when I think about the kinds of writing that I do, I think the fear of not knowing sometimes stops me from the writing. And what you're talking about is such a beautiful embrace of like, know what you know and also know what you don't know. And that's, I don't know, the lesson that I think I keep being reminded of time and time again. So selfishly, I'm going to thank you for that. Ben and Peter, you both sort of referred to this a little bit in terms of how the play is connected to you, or feels sort of reflective of familial story. And I think it's, you know, impossible for a writer to write something that doesn't in some way feel connected to themselves, whether it's a question they're grappling with or real life autobiographical experience. And so I'm just wondering if we can delve into that a little bit. And of course, I'm not going to ask you to divulge anything of like what in the play is about it happened to you, but rather to speak more broadly about how you think about sort of rooting or grounding in lived experience or family story, and how you think about sort of the transformation to a piece that is fictional, and the sort of making art from life, as opposed to you know, a perfectly valid form, documentary theater, which none of your plays are. So Mathilde, can I ask you to start with this one?
Sure. I think Peter sort of touched on this at the beginning of the conversation when he said that in some ways this play is the one that feels the most personal to him in some sense. And I'm paraphrasing, so forgive me if that's an incorrect way to say it. But when he was saying that, it made me think of, you know, when like I go to film because it's easier to have reference points, but like if Spielberg makes it, like, you know, like war movies or sci-fi movies or whatever, no one is like, what parts of that are real and what parts are not. And then if anyone does like a family drama or something, everyone's like, well, that's the story about his family, and that's exactly what happened. And there's no middle ground. And I actually think that most art that we create, even my play Dirty Laundry, that is the most autobiographical, factually thing I've written, there are things that it's not just that I take liberties in terms of certain facts, it's also that in some ways it's not. Factual truth is one thing, and then there's all kinds of different truths, and vice versa. And I think that it sort of does a disservice to try and be like, well, what piece and what, I don't think that it matters. I think what is interesting is, oh, an artist was compelled to write about this topic because there's a question. To me, it's when there's a question, you know, it sort of goes to the question that you asked before this one. And then not knowing, and what you were saying as an artist yourself, Pirronne, about wanting to write and being sort of blocked by not knowing all the things. But I actually think that that's a great place to start writing from, because when we know, and some writers do, some writers outline and they know exactly where they're going. But to me, there's something interesting about, oh, there is something alive in this for me because I have a real life questioning, whether or not the facts are real, you know, and most of my characters are composites of people I know, fictionalized, molded to what I need. But there's an emotional truth to, oh, this is a person who is grappling with this. And usually it comes from something unresolved in me. And I think that that's the most personal thing that I can say about this play, is that it would be a very different play if I was like, oh, this is how relationships should be, or that's how, but I don't know that. I don't presume I ever will. But there was a question there, and there's something I'm curious about in terms of like female desire post-motherhood, and that's very real in terms of this specific play and things that and it doesn't mean that what that character is experiencing is exactly what I experienced, but I do think that I am curious about that. I'm very curious about bodies in general. In a lot of my writing, I think a lot about like the physicalness of our bodies and what happens to our bodies when we give birth, when we have sex, when we die, things like that. And so I'm curious about that tangible, embodied experience, especially through the lens of someone who has given birth and whose body feels different.
Peter, can you talk a bit about sort of the relationship to the personal and how that reveals itself to you?
I mean, I think the big surprise for me about this play and the writing of it was that when I got to the end of it, I saw that it was a little Valentine to the theater, actually, which is that I think that what we discover with the pirates is that they're this group's way of kind of filtering their trauma through a lens of joy, or through a, I don't know if a lens is the right word, but through the act of making a play in the backyard, you know. And I think more than the story, because the story, you know, I mean, I think some of Pancho's stories are closer to me, like the box of names he mentions. I have that box of names. I've had that, or the fishbowl of names. It was a fishbowl when I was a kid, and now it's a box, but I still have it at 47 years old. And it's this little way that I have of controlling the people in the world. And it started off for me as a child in a place of like, this is how I can control a very uncontrollable world around me. I think all children feel that way, but I think if you come from a difficult space as a child, it was very helpful for me to have that imaginary space to work in. And so I think for me, I don't think I realized I was writing that play, but that is the play that came out, which is interesting. But I think ultimately the tone of the piece is what's ultimately me, which is that, as you know, I'm fundamentally incapable of hanging on to like a sacred moment or a funny moment as a person. If it gets too sacred, I'm definitely going to break it. And if it gets too funny, I'm going to break it too. I'm going to come at you, you know, like I'm going to find a way. So I think that my plays do that. And I love that. I think the only reason I know that about myself is because I write plays. I think if I didn't write plays, I would just think I was an asshole, really. But like, I understand myself better through the making of the piece. So, yeah, so I think that that's how the play is a reflection of my lived experience, and yet it is ultimately it's ultimately made up. I mean, it's all make believe, right? So I love what you say, Mathilde, though, about nobody looks at like a Spielberg war film and is like, interesting that, you know, they just sort of take it as the story. They don't connect it to the writer. But I do wonder if that's something to do with the theater versus film, but it's such an interesting question.
Yeah, absolutely. Ben, you talked a little bit about, you know, how this is inspired by your mother's side of the family who came from Guatemala. Can you talk a little bit more about sort of how you shift that lived experience into the characters you've created?
Yeah, totally. I'll say with most of my work, it always starts with some seed of the personal or something that means a lot to me. And then it becomes the act of removing it so that I can distance myself and discover something or learn something new about that experience by trying to create some distance. Um, I would say that with Fantasma, it similarly feels, well, similarly in terms of some of the other expressions of the writers on the panel, but different for me in that it is the closest to my personal experience of anything that I put on stage. Like so many of the stories that the women tell in the play are like direct things that happen to family members and stories that I've heard family tell, and I've never done that sort of one-for-one kind of translation into a play before. Usually I remove it a lot more from myself, or the play becomes a like, well, what if this were different about my life and my lived experience? How would that have changed things? So it becomes a real work of fiction. But with this, it really was a like, okay, I know my family came at this time to the United States. I know that they got amnesty. I know that they loved Reagan. I know that like so many of them are incredibly conservative in their politics and are Trump supporters. Like, how did that happen? And why did it happen? And that was sort of the investigation of the play. And I think I learned a lot of very real things about my family by writing the piece. But I think the ways in which I wrote the play to discover those things were not things that have actually happened in terms of interactions with family members. So, so yeah, so definitely I think the fabric I was drawing from was like a lot of fact, and a lot of deeply personal, firsthand kind of things. But the more I was writing the play and having to like really invest in characters, the more they became their own creatures, very different from anyone that I actually knew or anyone in my family.
It's so funny because as I hear you say that, Ben, I think about how every single play that I write is a fantasy of how I want things to go or I wish things had gone. And so the truth of my plays is actually rooted more in my idealism than the actual world is, if that makes sense. And I think I can see that in all of our work actually in this festival. Like there's a way in which it's not all like down to it being a documentation of what is real, but a documentation of what we desire. And I think I don't mean to speak for both of you, but I feel like that's what I see in your
I mean,
plays.
that's so beautiful that you do that. I think for me, it's the opposite. Like I write into the nightmarish version. Like I look at like how things went wrong, but how could they have gone worse? And that tends to be like what I write into, personally. But yeah, I think that's because or like the scary thing that I wasn't able to face at some point in my life. And like, what if I had like more courage and like had gone into it, like, what might that have felt like? Yeah, so similar, but I think it's you lean into the optimism, and I think I go the pessimistic route maybe.
Well, to be clear though, I think that we often can fantasize about that nightmare as well, right? Like there's a way in which like the scariest scenario is also a kind of fantasy, because in order to imagine it, you have to sort of allow yourself, I mean, you have to allow yourself to go to like the worst place possible as well as you're dreaming up writing it. What do you think? So
It makes me think about this is sort of a little bit of a tangent, but it makes me think about what conflict is, because I think that we do fantasize about the best way and the worst way that things can happen. And I think in particular, when we have a fight, it's like, oh, well, it could have gone this way and this way and this way. And sometimes that's like, and here's how we make up at the end. And sometimes it's like, I wish I'd said this really cutting thing. And I wish I'd had the guts to, like throw the glass of wine in this person's face. And then and we sort of want to have the recklessness and the lack of, we want to, it's the fantasy is also what would the world look like if I didn't have societies like all the forces that restrain us, and I could just like be a force and be myself unapologetically, and what would that look like and be. But it also makes me think I think that conflict can be a fight, and conflict can also be like people who love each other and can't articulate something in a way that the other person can hear, and it just so there can be love, there can be hope, there can be like tragedy, there can be so many things. And so I think for me, what you're both saying are sort of the spectrum of what makes a good play, which is you want that conflict, but the conflict doesn't have to be. I think when students start, and I've taught sort of like very young students, so maybe this is different by the time they get to where you're teaching them, Peter, but the people that the younger folks that I teach have a tendency to be like, and then there's a knife, and then the person's dead. And I think that there's something really beautiful about what you were saying, Peter, about like, well, conflict can also be about how can I stand up for myself and also bend to, like I think of my play, and I think the conflict she's facing is like, well, I want to set my boundaries and I want to like be true to what I want. I also want to try new things, and I also want to be a good partner to you. So how do I do all of those things at once? And so the inner conflict of that creates this tension within her, I think. I don't know, it's just something that sparked when you were talking about the two sides of the coin.
because she loves him, like she loves him, and she's being told, I think culturally, that she's not allowed to love him in the way that she maybe wants to, and she can't. I don't know. Anyway, I think about both your plays a lot. I'm always thinking about both your plays. So
Yeah, I think love, it's like we want to see all of humanity and the emotions that are sort of messy, I think, in theater. And so the messiness of love, that's not just like, great, we found each other, now it's happily ever after, like all the other stories we've been fed. But
Mhm.
also sometimes the opposite is true. Like sometimes in the ugliest moments, there's beauty. So it's a sort of an interesting thing.
We're going to be shifting to Q&A soon, so I just want to encourage our attendees, if you haven't had a chance to pop a question into the Q&A function, please feel free to do so. But before we do, I always like to ask this question because because it's tough times in the American theater, and I like to live in hope and live in what's bringing us joy, both as artists and as audience members. And so I'm just wondering if you all can talk a little bit about what's giving you hope in these challenging times and what you're hungry for in the future. And anyone can go first.
I think a lot of things. I come from Belgium. I'm not American. I believe in state funding for the arts. And I think a lot of the problems here come from the fact that we don't really have that here. However, I also am a big believer in sometimes the value of limitation and what that can spark creatively. And so I wonder what will happen. I don't know. I'm interested in perhaps a decentralization of the American theater that does tend to get polarized to New York and maybe a little bit in Chicago, urban areas. And I'm curious what else might be possible in this new landscape and whether that might shift. I'm curious about shifts. I think there's also been a lot of shifts in terms of representation and diversity and inclusion, and that feels like there's movement. I don't know. I'm just curious about change. I think change is good, but I also think that people should get paid, and I also think that what's tricky is that when there's that sort of atrophy, there was never enough opportunity for the amount of talent. But when that shrinks, it creates sometimes some feelings of like just that scarcity mindset that breeds competitiveness. And one of the things I love about the Playwrights Center is this idea of sort of breaking that down and finding ways to build bridges. And the fact that the three of us got to be there at the same time and spend time together and share just was a wonderful reminder that artists love each other and actually root for each other's success deep down. Like the field will be better if really great work gets made. And we all will be better for it, all of us. So.
Thank you, Mathilde. Peter, what's bringing you hope?
I think to pick up where Mathilde left off with the experience that I had at the Playwrights Center, it's very easy to feel out to sea as a writer. What we do, it can be very solitary, and yet we do what we do. We don't write fiction. We don't write other forms of writing because we actually need people. And I think like when I'm around people, other artists, I feel so much more alive and awake. And so the experience that I had during PlayLabs was really profound for me and actually sort of gave me a little bit of new life, or a lot of new life, I would say, which was needed. I think what's giving me hope is that as I'm getting older, I'm sort of moving away from having so much need to be a little star. I'm trying to kind of I'm trying to sort of allow myself to exist as I exist as Peter in various communities that I enter, to think about what my own community is here, the community of students that I have, the community here in Poughkeepsie, New York, what's out there beyond, you know, the one or two theaters that I kind of have gone through my life thinking, if I don't get produced there, then I haven't succeeded as an artist. What's giving me hope is thinking more broadly and actually beginning to fundamentally understand it when people say abundance is real. Because, you know, you hear people say like, oh, you know, there's abundance. And I'm like, what the are you talking about? What abundance are you talking about? For years, I felt that way. Like, but now I'm starting to understand what that means. That it I don't know. I mean, I think I've known this at my core all along, you know. But I think that the reason that we're starting to see more and more artists who no one's ever heard of is because people are really investing in this idea of community and work that matters and writers that matter and writers that do interesting things. So I don't know that I do have some hope, but not every day. Not every day. There are some days where if you caught me on the wrong day, I would be like, Pirronne? No, I don't have an answer. You know, but I think that's where I am today.
Yeah, by no means is this question to encourage toxic positivity, but rather to just sort of ask for your glimmers, your silver linings, but sort of like what lights you see in this very difficult field, in this very difficult moment, not just in the theater, but in the world. It's just that there's a lot going on. Benne, what are your thoughts on this? What brings you hope?
Yeah, I think the most invigorated I've felt maybe in the last year was getting to be in the position of being a teacher for the first time, like in an extended process through the Playwrights Center. I got to teach like an 8-week course on revision, and I think I've been in the position for a long time of feeling like the kid or the student, or like, you know, like I've just always been conscious of my elders and always felt like, I don't know, like the generation below. And so it was really interesting to be in a position now that I've been pursuing playwriting for 10 years now to have like students and thinking about that lineage of teachers. Like I love my teachers and even these people who have inspired me that weren't really my teachers either, but just thinking about how this craft and art form has been passed down and the love for it, and in addition to the craft of it, and to feel like I was maybe able to like impart some of that to students for the first time, but also feeling that that sense of inspiration also goes upward, and feeling how much like engaging with their work and asking them questions and hearing them talk about their plays was just like the most fun that I've had in a long time. And yeah, I guess that was just a very new sensation for me. I guess I just hadn't been aware of the ways in which like a person can be fed by their students, and inspired by them. So that was something that brought me hope that there are other artists who are interested in this art form, that it's not one that is boring or that is going to die, that there are people who are interested in carrying the torch on, and that feels really inspiring and gives me a lot of hope.
Awesome, thank you. And a lot of really great questions from our attendees. Thank you all so much. And we'll try to hit as many of these as we can. We had a question about daily writing process. Do you have any rituals that you find really helpful? If any of you have any sort of like tools or tricks or things that are in your toolbox for maybe the day of writer's block that you'd like to share.
I can jump in. I'll say that like for me, I typically try to do Julie Cameron's The Artist's Way morning pages every morning, just as a form of like brain drain to like get everything that I think might be an impediment to really being able to focus and go in on the writing if I'm about to enter a writing day. It also helps if I know that I want to accomplish writing that day to like have my cell phone on do not disturb and like not check my email first thing in the morning. Like I have to like disengage with all technology as much as possible so that I can try not to allow my like brain bandwidth to get like thinned out quickly. So yeah, those are things I would say that I practice, right?
As a side note, I want to say that I also deeply admire your like email auto reply when you're in workshop, where you're like, I'm in workshop, my response will be delayed. And I'm just like, now that is a person who's protecting their creativity. And I deeply, deeply support it. I hope I didn't like divulge something too private about you just now. But, no, I just think it's like a really awesome boundary setting to make sure that like when you're in workshop, because it's just so easy to get consumed with our emails and whatnot. Mathilde, do you have a writing ritual that you'd like to share?
Oh, you know, I feel like I used to, and then I had a child, and I hear people talk about morning pages, and I'm like, fuck you all. Sorry, I should not swear on this, but um, I think no, I don't anymore. I write when I can. I will say with time, I have become less precious. I used to be like, oh, to write, I have to have at least 3 hours of continuous time to like get into it. Otherwise, it's not worth it. And I've come to learn that that's not true, that I can sit down for a much shorter time if that's all I have, and it's still worthwhile. And it's worthwhile even if I don't produce anything worthwhile in that time. Because it unlocks something to do it more regularly. But yeah, I used to be better. I used to like set the room a certain way and like do it in the morning and read for, you know, I did different versions of it. So sometimes the morning pages, sometimes it's like, oh, read for a half hour to be in words, and then all this stuff. And no, I do it. I wish I did. I wish I could write more. I find that starting is very hard for me. And I procrastinate a lot, and I do start to read and try and like immerse myself in the research piece of it, which is just procrastination. But I find that when I'm in something, I really want to write. And that's a sign to me typically that like, oh, I'm onto something worthwhile. Because so much I throw away, so much of what I write. And oftentimes I'll write and I don't get that sense of, oh, I want to keep going. And oh no, I have to go pick up my kid at school, but I really want to keep going. And when I don't feel that way, it's a sign that maybe it's not clicked yet.
Great, thank you. Peter, can I specifically ask you to talk a bit about the invitation to write scenes a la carte and like how I know that may not be your writing ritual per se, but I just wonder, I feel like it was such a gift in our process, that invitation from incredible actor and playwright Michelle De Hoya, that I wonder if it might resonate with someone who's listening tonight.
Yeah, so when I came to the center, I had not heard the play read ever by anyone, and so when we read it, it was 55 minutes long, and I was like, "Whoa, that was a lot shorter than I thought it would be." And I definitely felt like there was more story to tell. And actually, I was kind of happy because I was like, "Oh, it's always easier to like for me to write new work than it is to rewrite existing work." But because my play has this kind of funny structure, Michelle suggested in the room that I just write a la carte scenes that didn't necessarily fit into the structure of what I had already. And what was so great about that was that it allowed me to just create scenes without having to like undo the entire play and move things around in what existed. It allowed me to just create new material. And then if those scenes were kind of hot or they were working in some ways, then I was able to the next day go through and see how I can kind of drop them in or pull other things out and move things around. But the first step of that rewriting process was not thinking about the undoing, because what is so intimidating about rewriting is the idea that you have to sort of pull something out of your play and the whole thing will just start to unravel and you've just got this giant mess. So allowing the space to like not have to think about how it works structurally was huge. Process wise, I've had to really release myself from being perfect process wise. I think like I've had to like say that I'm not consistent. I'm not going to write every day. I tend to write when people are waiting for the work. And so sometimes I have to arrange situations so that they're like waiting in my living room downstairs and I'm upstairs finishing it. Like I need the people to do it, otherwise I'll just choose to do other things. And like I've learned to be okay with this in recent years, or recent months, I should say. And something I think about a lot is like, sometimes I just ask myself to sit down at a table for an hour and actually do nothing, with my computer open and with my notebook open, and just say, you are allowed to do nothing for this 1 hour. You can literally look at the wall, but no phone, no books, just sit there, just sit there. And when I do this every once in a while, I find that of course, after 10 minutes, I'm bored and I start writing something. And that's really helpful to me, to take away the pressure of being like capital W writer, you know, like just the idea of being a writer, I think is very attractive, like when you're like a student, but then when you actually have to do it all the time, it's like, it's a lot. So I think, and I also remember like hearing as a young writer, like older famous writers talk about their processes, and then feeling for years like, oh, I'm not a real writer because I don't do it like them. And I just think, don't do it like them. Do it like you do it. And like, if it's messy and silly, and you don't feel like a real writer while you're doing it, maybe you need to make it not be real in order to write. You know, maybe you need to take it less seriously. I don't know. So for me, that's my process lately, is that there's no process. It's a mess until I come into the room, and then hopefully it's not a mess. And that's okay. If I were a neater person, I would not be a playwright. That's all I'm saying. You know? Not me.
That's great.
Chase bank and making a lot of money. You know what I mean? I'm just not that, my mind is not orderly like that. I don't work like that. And I had to like remove that pressure. So
Yeah, absolutely. We have a couple questions that are specific to a couple of you. And Ben, I'm wondering if you can talk a bit about the bilingual nature of Phantasma, how you think about the usage of Spanish versus English over the course of the play, and how that might or might not relate to the audience you envision for this work.
Yeah, I think first of all, and just keeping with the authenticity of like how these characters would talk, I just grew up around Spanish being spoken all the time, and especially when it was my mother and her sisters and my grandmother. My grandmother speaks exclusively Spanish. She understands a lot of English, but isn't fluent. My mom and her generation, her sisters are all fully bilingual, and then my generation, we're all pretty poor Spanish speakers, and some of us don't at all. So that felt like something that I really wanted to have reflected in the play, especially about thinking about culture and relationship to language. And it at first felt really natural that the play would begin exclusively in Spanish, just by virtue of who is on stage, and end exclusively in English based on who's on stage. But then I began to realize how much of that actually mirrors this idea of assimilation. And it became like something that I was like, I actually have to preserve this as part of the idea of the play and like the journey that we're watching occur. And because my Spanish is not great, I had to work with a translator to like make sure that like this Central American sort of Guatemalan Spanish was something that felt really true to how these characters would actually speak. So yeah, so it was a collaboration, but also it just felt like an important part of the fabric of just like how to tell the story regardless of who the audience is.
And I just have to say, I love the act of watching it as a non-Spanish speaker, because it puts me in the shoes of like my mother coming to the US, not speaking very much English, you know, and what it is to try to sort of piece together what's happening when you don't have a facility for the entire language just yet. And I think it's just such a useful empathic exercise for an audience to say, like, for a non-Spanish speaking audience member, I mean to say, like, I'm going to be a little on the outside of this, and that's actually a really important experience for me to have. So I just want to like just to fully endorse that once again, how beautiful that choice is and how important I think that choice is. Mathilde, I have a specific question for you as well, because there've been some more questions about sort of the way you calibrated like pace and the sort of acceleration of time passage in towards the end of the play that's sort of toggling between characters that then sort of also catapults us forward. Is that something that just in terms of like rhythm and musicality, can you talk a bit about sort of how you work on that on your own versus like sort of what happens then in the room and how the workshop process revealed things to you in that?
Yeah, I have another play that functions very similarly. My other plays are very different, but I realized the play I wrote right before I wrote this one also there's a chorus, but aside from the chorus, there are three main characters. One of them stays there throughout, the other two toggle. And then at the end, it's the other two that end the play with a meeting, but they also sort of go forward in time with an exploration. And I was like, oh my God, I wrote the same play. This is shocking. And a little bit really sort of terrifying in terms of content. But I think that clearly it's a structure I'm drawn to. When I'm working on it on my own, I think I can get lost a little bit in the cleverness of it sometimes. And so the draft that I brought to the workshop, the way that the scenes start to sort of the first scene is like, oh, it's a scene between these two people. And the second scene is a scene between these two people. And then someone else walks in at the end, and then it becomes about them. But those are sort of more traditional scenes. And then very quickly, there's a scene, I think in like scene 4 or something, where you've got these two characters, and then they start talking about something that happened between this character and someone else. And then suddenly you're there. And then they start talking about this, and then suddenly you're there. And the way that starts to happen at first was a little bit of a trick. It was like semantics. And what I discovered in the workshop process was that pacing wise, I like that you use the word musicality. Like, I think that the play found a pace at which it just the emotional logic again, it made sense that actually the place in which it starts to do this is when she starts having sex with both of them. It's not semantics. It's not them. It used to be she's talking about dating apps with her husband, and then she's talking about dating apps with Ty. And suddenly we're like, oh, funny joke here leads to funny joke here. And it wasn't earned. Whereas when it starts to happen because she's having new sex, she's having to unpack it with her husband, but then that's creating tension. And then that it just made the heart of the play more apparent, I think. And then in terms of how it ends, I knew coming in that I wanted to make that messier when she breaks up with Ty and she's sort of in two scenes at once. But I didn't really find it until I could hear it and really lean into, okay, how much can I get away with it? And that was a trial and error. And it took several rounds of edits on that scene to find just quite how quickly can she go here and there. And then he says, I only get half of you, and she's talking to him and suddenly she's not. And how do we sort of choreograph that? So actors are wonderful, wonderful creatures. And I credit them in all of my plays. Actors' fingerprints are all over, directors' fingerprints are all over. And then in terms of the going forward in time after the breakup with Ty, I think that it's just an I'm curious about like all the possible things that might happen to them. And one of them, there was a time when I wanted to end the play with a coin toss and do they get divorced or not? And you would flip a coin on stage and then they would do two different endings to the play based on that. And one ending would be her and her husband, and one ending would be her running into Ty, and Ty now has a family and she runs into him pushing a stroller, and there's this little scene there and she shares with him that she's divorced. But I also felt then like it was simplifying all the possible outcomes to two, she's divorced or she's not, and that didn't feel true to the play. And so I wanted to hold the possibility that there could be a million things that happen to them. What the marriage is it good, is it bad, does it last or not? But also if it lasts, is it, there's 75 types of marriages. And if it doesn't, there's 75 types of relationships with a co-parent. So I don't know, I was trying to sort of imagine what happens from this point in time. And that felt fun.
I love that too, because I think it also subverts like the idea that you brought up earlier of like not wanting to sort of judge what an open marriage is, or like that a play where there's one of two outcomes, only one of two outcomes, and that there are only two possible outcomes, I think suggests a kind of either endorsement or indictment.
Yeah, and I think also the other thing that I guess it's so many narratives that we're fed as little girls in particular are like you know, and they get married and then they live, you know, and the princess finds and then da da da. Rom-coms are over when the two characters get together. And I think for me, I was really interested in, well, what happens after? And this is what's happened after for them. But there will also be another after. Like it never ends.
Right.
And so this simplistic idea that you can sort of put a bow on a story and then now you know, it's never over. You know, there's going to be so many fights in their marriage if they stay together. There's going to be so many, and moments of beauty when they connect if they're divorced. And I don't know, I just felt like I wanted that. But I knew pretty early on that Ty disappears.
Yeah. I could talk to y'all all night, but sadly, we are actually a little over our time. But I want to give you a moment. We usually plug our next events at the Playwrights Center at this moment, and we're at the end of our public season. And so all I can say is check back with us in the fall when we'll have a new public season. So in this moment, I want to offer y'all the opportunity, if there's anything you want to plug, anything you have coming up, or another artist whose work you think folks should check out, or a book you're reading that's really awesome, or an album of music. I don't know what the kids are listening to these days. Anyway, now is a moment for plugs, either shamelessly self-serving or oh, thank you, Julia Brown, for reminding me. We do have an event coming up. It is the McKnight Theater Artist Fellows Works in Progress on June 24th at the Capri Theater in Minneapolis. Thank God for Julia Brown. I would be lost without her. And now to y'all, what do you want to plug?
There are about 1,000 wonderful new things running in New York City at the moment. There's so many things running that it's impossible to see them all, by wonderful playwrights who I respect, from like Broadway all the way down to off Broadway, which causes me hope, as we were talking earlier. So I think I just want to plug like a quick trip to New York City to see some stuff, which I realize is obnoxious for a largely Minneapolis audience, but I'm sure that the same thing's happening in Minneapolis. So I just want to plug everyone going out to see the theater. That's all for me.
Ben?
Me? Okay, I'm going. For anybody who is in Los Angeles or Orange County, I have a play called Alma that's at the Chance Theater right now. It just got extended, so it'll be playing through the 31st. So if you can check that out. I'm in Maine right now. I just finished the first week of rehearsal towards a production that's going up at Portland Stage at the end of the month as well. So if you're on the East Coast in this corner, if you want to check out this play called Manning, that's really weird and has a giant zucchini. And then for anybody who's in Chicago later this summer, First Floor is doing a production of my play In His Hands, if you want to check that out.
I mean, it's so frustrating because all the things I'm thinking of just so when Peter was talking about being in New York, I was like, oh yeah, Peter and I went to see a great play together. We went to see Grief Hotel and it was fantastic, but also you can't see it anymore. So, sorry. But it's great. It's funny. It's been a while since I've seen something that, really snuck up on me the way that play did. I found that really satisfying. And I thought the directing was really, really crisp, and I thought the acting was phenomenal. That's the thing that came to mind, but there's so many things, but all the things are closing. So I don't know, go see Ben's play.
Go see Ben's play, and also watch out for other productions of Grief Hotel, maybe happening in your various cities.
It's
our
written
dear
by
audience.
Liza Birkenmeyer and was directed by Tara? Was it directed by Tara?
Ahmadinejad. Mhm.
Yeah. And it's produced by Club Thumb and New Georgia. So, you know, send your plays to them because they're awesome. Both those theaters
That's
are.
right. That's right. Like I said, y'all, I could talk to you all night. But I'm going to respect your time and say this is the end of our conversation. I want to thank you all so much for your generosity and brilliance and insight, and to our attendees for joining us. Thank you. Like I said, McKnight Theater Artist Fellows Works in Progress is June 24th at the Capley Theater in Minneapolis. Otherwise, please keep in touch with us. Keep checking the Playwrights Center website for more and more events as they come. Thank you all. Stay safe and healthy and have a wonderful night.